Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to Rooted in Healing. I am so grateful that you're here. If you've made it this far, thank you for your patience with me. I'm very excited about this module, the third one in our series on intergenerational trauma, because in this particular episode, I'll get to actually really walk you through how trauma is transmitted. We're talking a lot about trauma, obviously, and, I'm a psychologist. I've been practicing in training for a long time, alhamdulillah. And so I hear very clearly from people the wide range of reactions and responses that people have to generally to like mental health, and then to generally like trauma, and then to intergenerational trauma. I was watching a reel on Instagram recently where someone, I think it was like a comedian, saying like, you need to get over this. Like, how are you in your 30s and you're still talking about like what happened to you in your childhood? And I have a very clear answer to that. And I'm very excited to go through that today and talk about how some of this stuff, y'all, I'm going to be just really honest with you. We're talking about healing trauma in this series, but depending on the trauma that you experience in your life, as well as when you started realizing it and reworking and rewiring, habits and patterns and internal structures, those two things are going to make a really big difference in terms of how long this work takes. And if I'm being very honest, I am, inshallah, being very honest, but the reality also is that for some people, this work could take decades. It could even be the rest of your life that you are still working through and learning about how the trauma in your childhood or in your life continues. Because I just want to make one thing clear, that if you experience a lot of like intergenerational trauma in your childhood, you are very likely still experiencing it today. It is not the case that like all of a sudden you turn 18 and then you have this like individuation experience, and then all of a sudden nothing affects you. You could be 50 years old. I actually had a patient once, some years ago, who was over 50 years old. And her mom was like a huge part of our work together, her relationship with her own mom, who was in her 70s, that we had to bring her mom in. And I had a mother-daughter session with someone in their 50s and someone in their 70s, and had to kind of rework some of their communication patterns with each other, what they're saying versus what they're implying versus what is kind of like taken from it versus what they're hearing, etc. So I say that to say that like this work does not end for some of us and for many of us. And honestly, if we're, I'm assuming that if you're listening to this podcast, then you might be somebody who is on this like ongoing journey of healing and learning about yourself and just improving as a person. And so I hope that work forever thing is not daunting, and instead actually is like, okay, you know what? This is my life. This is part of my life. Let me see what parts of it I can try to improve so that I can improve the quality of my life and ultimately be able to worship Allah, worship God in a much more kind of wholehearted way. And that's the purpose of this entire series as well, is I want you all to have easier access to who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. Who are you? What are the characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you? How do you know and take advantage of those qualities? And also recognize that there are some qualities that, not just qualities, but even circumstances that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen for you and has written for you and is already going to happen to you whether you enjoy it or not. Like I think a lot about, sometimes I kind of remind my clients like, your life is not over. Like you're still going to continue to live moving forward, and we really don't have any idea what's going to happen to us in the future. It's pretty easy to kind of actually guarantee that you will continue to experience trauma in your life. And so the work that we do to minimize the impact of trauma, but also sometimes even to use the trauma, use those really difficult experiences as ways to develop your own spirituality, strengthen your relationships with the people around you, have a stronger sense of self. There are so many ways that trauma itself actually can transform us to become better people. And I think a very clear example of that is, watching the ongoing and escalating genocide in Palestine, but also the genocides that are happening all around the world, and witnessing those traumas, witnessing really difficult things happening to other people, or sometimes things that happen to us, can be a motivating factor for us to improve. Okay, and so in the last episode, we explored the importance of grounding. And, I did that intentionally in the beginning because, we spoke in the first module about the nervous system and how it operates through trauma, right? Your nervous system kind of gets hijacked and does its own thing, believing that you're in danger, even after the danger itself is no longer there. And so you could be just like driving to work, or, walking to the store in a parking lot, whatever it is. You could just be, just sitting on your couch, and there can be some sort of trigger that happens. And that a trigger could be something externally, like, you see somebody who reminds you of a parent that was very abusive, or you smell something that is associated with a memory where you were abused, or you see a shirt that somebody is wearing that reminds you of a shirt that you wore as a child, and you had a really difficult time in your home as a child. And so any of these things can happen externally, but there are also internal triggers that happen. And so that can vary from just like a memory. Sometimes memories pop up in our brain for different reasons, mostly unconscious, but sometimes, for conscious reasons. But a memory could pop up. It could even be, when I say internal, like a physical sensation that you have in your body that maybe reminds you of a very stressful time. I know, like, for example, the gag reflex is one that can come up for people and really kind of spiral them into a traumatic state, etc. And so part of me sharing these examples is really for you to be able to start really identifying what are the external and internal triggers that you have, in addition to, and we'll talk about this later on in the future modules, but in addition to, what are the external contexts that you can be in, and what are the internal ways of being that can actually really help you evolve as a person and grow and heal. And so being able to identify these things and being very honest with yourself about these things requires a deep understanding of who you are. And so in our last episode, like I said, we explored the importance of grounding, because sometimes, like I said, you could just be like, sitting in class or, listening to a podcast, and all of a sudden your fight or flight, your nervous system, your stress response system becomes very activated. And so one of the main things to do here is grounding. As your body is becoming activated, as your mind is racing, being able to pause, take those deep breaths, remember that you exist in a body, reminding yourself that you are safe, repeating, small prayers and dhikr can all be very, very helpful ways to bring you back to homeostasis, back to equilibrium, so that you can function a little bit better in your day-to-day, so that you don't yell at your kid, or you don't send that angry text, or you don't slam the door when you're, leaving a classroom, etc. So there's all these ways that all of these ways that grounding can just be so important, right? How do you return back to safety when the body or mind starts to feel overwhelmed? And so today we're going to go one step deeper, and we're actually going to go ahead and talk about how trauma moves across families and generations. This might be one of the most important conversations we'll have in this course, because many of us are currently living out these stories that we didn't write. And, often we're not really completely in control of our own lives, but we still carry these fears, the silence, the patterns, the pain that didn't start with us. It started a long time ago, but it's carried through the generation. But inshallah, what I hope we can do through this podcast and through the process groups that I'm also offering, I can be the ones to at least filter and shift the course for the ones after us. We can increase our own awareness about what we're doing, what we're saying, and how we're existing, paying attention to the social responsibility and the social consequences, actually, also of our experiences through trauma, through intergenerational trauma, and shift course. And, I want to do another little promo for the process group, because that's exactly what that is. The trauma that we experience intergenerationally is going to affect our interpersonal relationships, our relationships with other people. And so the purpose of this group is to be able to process the intergenerational trauma piece. But the second really big goal here actually is to pay attention to the way that it shows up in our interpersonal relationships, the way that we talk to one another, the way that we show up in community. And so I'm hoping that these process groups, which will be a maximum of 7 to 8 people, which will run for 7 weeks. I have planned 2 happening this fall, is supposed to be an opportunity for you to see, like, how do I talk about myself or talk about what I've gone through in a way that isn't like off-putting to other people, that's like inviting. How do I show up in a space with other people in a way that I want to be able to show up, in the way that aligns with my values? And so we'll be doing all of that work in the process group. It's 7 weeks. And honestly, I believe so much in the power of interpersonal process groups that I'm pretty sure that if you joined one, you're going to want to join the next. So go to my website, heyhashem.com, go to the Rooted in Healing tab, and sign up for a process group. So trauma, let's do it. So trauma is transmitted. It's not just experienced. We, for just, I guess, neutral reasons, we inherit more than our ancestors' physical characteristics. We also inherit sometimes their, character, just as I would say, the characteristics. But sometimes we inherit personalities. How often have you heard, like, wow, you remind me so much of your aunt is so much like this, or like you're so much like your dad, or you're so much like your grandmother. And so consider the ways that just even our way of being can be transmitted. But one of the things that we also inherit is also the nervous systems that we've been talking about. We also inherit our response to trauma, our response to abuse. We inherit silence. We inherit anger. We inherit coping mechanisms like people pleasing or perfectionism or avoidance, not just through behavior, but also through so many other avenues that we're going to talk about today. So this process of inheriting through generations, that's what we're calling intergenerational trauma. I want to just, pause here for just a second to say that one of the difficult things about creating curriculum for this and recording a podcast is that in my work with people who have experienced intergenerational trauma is that it can look so different for so many different people. It can look just as different as we are different. And part of the reason for that is because, each of us have a particular temperament, a particular kind of way of being. Like, some of us are a little bit more shy. Some of us are a little bit more anxious. Some of us are a little bit more outspoken. And so those kind of inherent qualities, our temperament, is definitely going to affect how we respond to our environment. And then our environment all looks very different because we can talk about the temperament of each parent, right? So that's already a combination of a lot of unique factors. We can talk about the political and social and economic history of the country or countries that your parents and ancestors are from. We can talk about the system that you grew up in, the education system, who are the other adults in your life, Did you grow up in a community where everybody was involved in your parenting, or did you grow up in a space where it was really just one or two people? All of these things are going to matter a lot. Other things that are going to affect everything that I'm talking about is also the duration and the intensity of the trauma that someone has experienced. I actually didn't have this written out in my curriculum, but I think it's an important time to kind of share with you all that when we think about trauma, sometimes our mind goes automatically to abuse. Some sort of abuse, that physical, emotional, verbal, financial, sexual abuse that has happened to somebody, and that's what would cause their system to respond in the way that we've talked about previously. But there's also actually this other kind of like deadly trauma, I would say, that goes so unnoticed. It goes so unnoticed, and it's very, very important to talk about, which is neglect. We have abuse, right? Which is us which is when something is kind of added to the system. There's some sort of manipulation happening. And then there's neglect, which means when your needs are just not being met. And every single person, every single human being has several survival needs. Unfortunately, in today's climate, it feels like we're all like arguing, having the most intense conversations about like what is the bare minimum that we can give humans, or what is the bare minimum that humans have a right to. We're having conversations right now about like our aid. Just give them aid. Just give them baby formula. Give them baby formula. Instead of having conversations about like how is the world evolving and growing, and how can we encourage thriving, and how can we make our standard of living come from a place of I want to say a place of abundance, of baraka, of like what God has given us, versus from a place of like, what is the minimum that I can give this person? Unfortunately, we can again talk about capitalism here, but I won't spend too much time there. But what I'll say, though, is that when it comes to neglect, this really is a very silent killer, I will say. Children and adults, right? So, okay, this is also really important to share, which is that in our trajectory as human beings, there are consistent needs that we need throughout our entire lives. So, for example, you always, as long as you're alive, will need to drink water. You will always need to eat food. You will always need to rest and sleep. You will always need shelter. The other thing that you will always need, and I say need very, very, with lots of emphasis, is safe relationships and community. We need it. We see the rising suicide rates. We see the epidemic of loneliness. This is not just like something that, people are just complaining about in first world countries. Loneliness can really kill a person. And so we always need not just relationships, we need safe relationships. And so safe relationships become a basic human need for survival throughout your entire life. Now, when we think about children need it way more. If you had the option to hang out with an adult or hang out with a child, I highly recommend hanging out with that child because their nervous system really is still developing. Their brain is still developing. Their whole body, their whole internal world structure is still developing. And so children, they rely on the adults around them. They rely on everyone around them, but especially the adults around them to teach them how to relate to one another, how to function, how to, make friends, how to cope with stress. Children are watching and they're listening and they absorb. The thing to know here is that because they're still developing at a very accelerated rate compared to adults, and adults are still developing, we're developing until we die. That is the case. We are always going through some sort of development. Adulthood, just, life and movement and change, it doesn't end when it comes to the workings of our body, which is pretty cool. But when it comes to children, they're still developing. And so the experiences that you had when you were a child, all of those experiences actually kind of became ingrained into your conscious, unconscious, your physical self, etc. Our brain is a very plastic organ in our body. And every experience that we have, there's some form of neural network that is happening. There's some sort of like neural activity that is happening whenever we are just like experiencing life. So if you, move your eyes to the side, your brain clocked that. If you are sitting down, you're shifting, your brain clocked that. If somebody walks into a room and you just glance at them, your brain clocked everything about that person, even if your conscious mind may not captured everything, but your unconscious, it clocked it. There's some studies that are shown where people, are shown an image like a split of a second, but they're able actually to remember that image. Even if they like don't consciously remember it, they're able to unconsciously say like, oh yeah, that, the image was a green apple, etc. So everything is being ingrained into our brain. And for children, their brain, they don't have a whole brain yet, which sounds so strange to say, but especially their frontal cortex, it's still developing. I don't know if you've ever held like an infant. They have like a squishy little head, but their brain is growing. It's not all there and it's just growing bigger. It's actually, there's parts of their brain that actually just it's not developed yet. And so I want you to consider then all of the ways that the experiences that you had as a child have become ingrained into the neural network of your brain. There's so many ways. There's so many ways that we are impacted by the world around us. And the different pathways that I'm going to talk about today are just different pathways that anything is transmitted through generations. It doesn't just have to be trauma. So I want to kind of expand our understanding of what is passed through generations, but also be very mindful to talk to you specifically about the ways that trauma is transmitted. So intergenerational transmission of trauma, it happens through so many things. It happens through stories that are told, stories that are untold or not told at all, emotional responses that were modeled by the adults around you when you were a child, family roles that were assigned to us before we could even speak, cultural, spiritual beliefs that have been passed down from survival and not from reflection. You may have never heard your parents acknowledge their own pain, or maybe you heard them just speaking about their pain only and without really kind of acknowledging the full impact and kind of conclusion or resolution of what that pain may be. We don't only inherit the wounds that come from our parents and grandparents and sometimes our older siblings, but we also inherit the responses to the wounds. And so you may never have seen your father cry, for example, but if he numbed his pain with anger or withdrawal, then you learned. And you may have a parent that actually never really spoke about, their pain and their trauma, but it exists from other stories. But if they flinched when someone raises their voice, you learned. We are, as humans, co-regulating with the people around us at all times. I think that there's such beauty and wisdom to the social and collective accountability and responsibility that we have with one another, that another Muslim person, another human has rights upon you, that we don't have a choice actually when it comes to how we respond to the people around us, but there's still room for us to acknowledge and work through our just natural emotional responses to people. And actually, that's the task. The task is not to always be, friendly, outgoing, gregarious, etc. The task is not to always be, this like kind, gentle, like, stable person. The goal is the process. The goal is that we are working towards. Because as we move through our life, there's so many things that are going to continue to happen, like I said previously, just naturally. As you grow older, people around you start getting, they get married, and then people have kids, and then you're watching children grow up, and then you get married or you have kids, and now your body is changing, and you're thinking about, oh my God, how am I going to be a parent? Or your kid starts, to just not listen because they're a toddler and they have their own mind. And then your responses to their, them just being themselves, it comes sometimes from a place that you don't even know. You get a new job, you move to a new city, you read a new book. There's so many different experiences, right? You finally get an apology from a parent. You, lose somebody very close to you who, passes away and transitions. There's so many transitions that happens. I talk with my clients also about the transitions of the seasons. What does it feel like when summer turns into fall, or when fall turns into winter, or when winter turns into spring? These transitions are all part of what's ingrained into us. And so there's a level of self-awareness really that I feel like is impossible because there's so much information. There's so much happening to us. And so if you ever feel like what you're going through is so complicated and so intense that it's affecting your ability to just go by your day-to-day, I highly recommend that you go ahead and reach out to a therapist. I did create I have another episode on finding a competent therapist, and so I do encourage you to look into that for more information about how to find a therapist. But for now, we're going to continue with some just education. I want you all to know how does intergenerational trauma happen? So there are, I want to say like two main ways that, two or three, actually maybe three main ways that I'm going to talk about today. So the first is epigenetics, because intergenerational trauma is not just emotional. It's not just like what you see and what you hear. It's also biological. And this is where the field of epigenetics comes in. It's the study of how environmental factors like trauma or deprivation or neglect can change the way our genes are expressed. And then those changes are passed down in generations. I'm pausing for a moment because I'm trying to remember if I spoke clearly about why neglect is also traumatic. And so, because I started talking about like how we need safe relationships and we have all these like basic human needs. And so if any of those needs are not being met, subhanAllah, our bodies actually respond as if we're being abused. Like it responds in a very similar way. Your trauma response system, it gets activated. If you haven't had anything to eat, if, people in your household are yelling, if you have not, if a child has not had any, very close, warm, safe relationships in their childhood, all of these things are going to really, really significantly affect their trauma response system growing up. The other thing I think I forgot to mention is that the younger you are, because you're still developing, the larger the impact of the experiences that you have, both good or bad, because the trajectory is just much more malleable at an early stage. I also want to take this moment to actually recommend two books for those of you that like to read. Let's see. The first book is called What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma. The author is Stephanie Fu, and she does an incredible job with this book. This was published a couple years ago, and she actually goes through her own process of understanding her own trauma and how generational trauma has affected her and her relationship with her parents. The first part of the book is actually very, very traumatic. She talks about going through like severe neglect and abuse from both of her parents. They both abandoned her essentially when she was in high school, and she had to just kind of like figure out how to live on her own. And then the rest of the book talks about the journey she goes through to try to heal. And she actually does an incredible job with, she's a journalist also, which makes her an incredible researcher, an incredible writer. But she really goes through a lot of different methods of healing that we understand or that we know about today, including like somatic healing and EMDR and brain spotting, and there's just so many things that she goes through that I highly do recommend this book. The other book is called The Boy Who Was Raised. Let me see this. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And this is a book by Bruce Perry and Maya Zalovitz. This was a book published in 2006. This book is incredible. I cannot emphasize how important, how incredible this book is. It was, so Bruce Perry's a psychiatrist, and he worked with children who've experienced severe trauma and neglect. And each chapter of the book is a different case of a different child that he's worked with. And he does an incredible job describing what happens developmentally to a child when they experience different types of trauma at different points of their life. This was an incredible book. I cannot wait to read it again. I recommend it to all my students, and I recommend it to anybody who's interested in trauma and how it affects young people and how it then affects them for the rest of their life. So these are two books that I would really highly recommend. He also talks about epigenetics in that book, which brings me back to what I was originally talking about before I had to remind myself of things to share with you all. So epigenetics, there are many studies that have been done to show what epigenetics does to the body. There's studies that have been shown around the biological impact of trauma through studying children who were born during the famine in the Netherlands in the 40s. And so these were children who were in the womb during the famine. And those children showed long-term changes to one of their genes that was linked to metabolism and stress regulation decades later. So get this. The mothers, right, the adults were going through the famine, but the child in the womb carried the expression of some of these genes that affected metabolism and stress regulation. I'm going to try to say this in a different way. That means that if your parents were going through something traumatic, right? And I want you to think, so many of us have parents that were displaced, that were experiencing racism, that were experiencing sexism, that were like experiencing all of these traumas from like a community and societal point, but also in their own relationships. I, was working with a client who told me that she was witnessing her father physically abuse her mother. She was a child herself. She was around 7 or 8 years old. She was watching her father abuse her mother while her mother was 8 months pregnant. And so just from everything that I've shared with you so far, I'm sure you can just begin to imagine the impact that one instance will have on this child, the one in the womb and the one who is witnessing, for the rest of their lives. But consider that, things like that don't generally happen on a one-time basis. So it makes you wonder about the continuous effect of that trauma on that family. There's also studies that have shown with rats in particular. So let me take one little tiny step back and kind of explain how some of this epigenetic situation works. So essentially we carry all of these different genes in our body, and some of us are just, we have higher risk for certain diseases for many reasons. But say you have an individual who, for the first 40, let's say 25 years of their life, they're kind of doing okay, we can even say physically. And then all of a sudden, between 25 and 30, they just have all of these like health problems, whether it's like diabetes or heart problems, etc. Many studies have pointed back to the role of cortisol in the expression of these genes that this person was carrying. So they were already carrying the genes for diabetes and for heart disease, but the cortisol in their body activated, the stress response system actually activated these genes so that they actually, had diabetes or they had heart conditions. My dad actually is a cardiologist in Michigan, and he tells me so often about how, he's like, a lot of these issues that his patients come in with are stress related. Like, hey, you need to reduce your stress. How many of us have gone to the doctor and they said, you need to reduce your stress? That's what we're kind of talking about here. Well, one is sometimes the stress happened a long time ago and we're still carrying it. And then two is like, sometimes you can't control the stress in your life. Like there's so many mechanisms that push us into a stressful living situation. So there's another study on rats where they showed that this epigenetic transmission can occur through at least 3 or 4 generations, which is a heavy thing to think about. Because how many of us know the stories of our grandparents? How many of us know the stories of our great-grandparents? And even if you don't, how many of us can look at history books and see what happened? How many of us can see our own lives and just imagine where some of this stuff came from? So together, these studies really tell us something powerful, and that's our bodies, our physical bodies, our biology remembers what our families live through. It can be occupation, displacement, war, ongoing discrimination. The stress doesn't just live in the story, it lives in the nervous system, and it can affect how we respond to danger, how we raise our children, how we relate to our own emotions. But here's the good news. The good news is that epigenetic expression is not fixed, and that we can actually start to reverse some of these inherited stress patterns so that at the very least they're not transmitted down even more to the generations. But the reality is, like, some of our trauma is going to be transmitted. It's not the case that we're all going to be doomed and our children will, be experiencing what we're experiencing. Not at all. And actually, because you're listening to this, what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to build the skills and tools for yourself and continue building, I'll say, because I know that you already have quite a few yourself that you benefit from, but continue to learn these skills and tools and patterns so that we can teach them to the generation after us, whether that's our own children or just the children around us. So let's talk about the second section. So that's biology, our physical self. We talked a little bit about, even neural developmental pieces of it there. The second piece is a little bit more what we would call psychodynamic. And I really want to take our time here because this is one of the most tender and transformational pieces of intergenerational trauma work. So I'm going to start with attachment, then we're going to talk about attunement, and then we're going to talk about mirroring. So these all three go under the same category. So remember how I talked to you all just in this module about the importance of safe relationships. From the moment we are born, we are wired to bond. We reach for closeness, for protection, for love. And you can say it's because we're needy, but really it's because we're human. That experience never really goes away, reaching for closeness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as relational beings who crave intimacy. And this is true for us for the rest of our lives. But children and infants in particular, they don't really know much when they're first born. And so part of the first things that they start to learn is, how is my environment responding to my distress? This is a really, really important kind of first piece of information that an infant gets. that if my stomach is hurting or if I'm hungry, right, which is all things that babies kind of intuitively have a sense of, right? We kind of lose that as we grow older. We're not very good at telling if we're actually tired or we're actually distressed or we're actually hungry, but babies, they can tell. And so they start doing what babies do, which is cry. They start crying and they really don't know how to say, hey, I need my diaper change or my stomach hurts or whatever. And so you'll find parents kind of scrambling to find out what's going on. And so that distress signal, recall how we said distress, we were talking about a distress signal that comes out of the body through trauma, right? Something bad is happening. There's some sort of stress going on. We have this distress signal. And so children and infants and children as well, and adolescents, and even through our adulthood, we're paying attention to how people are responding to us. But really here, I want to emphasize an infant because we're talking about little. And so attachment is the system in our nervous system and psyche that tells us, am I safe? Will someone respond if I cry? Am I lovable? Our attachment patterns are formed in the first few years of life before we even have language. But they continue to develop and evolve throughout our life. I'm actually really excited here to talk to you all about attachment, in particular, attachment styles, because there's so much kind of pop culture information, and I feel that there's just so much to share that will kind of clear things up for people. So the patterns that show up, they become a blueprint for how we experience relationships, emotions, and even our own sense of self. One of the things that, attachment starts to kind of help us build is our internal structures. I call them our internal structures. Psychologists call them like the internal working model. Like, who am I and who are you? And can I trust the world around me to take care of my needs? How reliable am I to take care of my own needs? Because children and infants also need to learn to self-soothe. And how reliable are the adults around me or the people around me in taking care of my needs? So there are 4 general attachment styles. And I want you all to think about a quadrant. See, this is where if I'm teaching, I'm drawing on the board and I'm, showing people diagrams, etc. But I want you to think about a quadrant, right? Like, so an x-axis and an x-axis that goes, from positive to negative, and then a y-axis that goes from positive to negative. And so I want you to think, so there's going to be 4 kind of categories in this quadrant. Now, even though they're categories, it's important to continue thinking about it in a quadrant because there's a spectrum on all of these levels. We're going to talk about anxious attachment and avoidant attachment, for example. 2 people can both have what we would call avoidant attachment, but it could look very different for both of them because one person has a much more reliable view of themselves than the other person. But both have a much higher, view and reliable sense of self than, the average person. Okay, so we have 4 quadrants, and think about the x-axis as the reliability of self. So everybody kind of on the positive side of the x-axis have a positive sense of reliability of self. Like they can say to themselves, like, I can take care of myself. Now I'm very hesitant here to say if this is necessarily a positive or negative thing, because it could be a positive thing until it's a negative thing. But essentially, right, on this x-axis, we're talking about reliable sense of self. So people on the positive side, they have a general thought that I can take care of things. I can take care of myself if I need to. People on the negative side of this x-axis don't have that self-reassurance internal world. So they don't believe that they can take care of themselves. You'll find people here generally kind of seeking other people, seeking reassurance. Oftentimes people pleasing is happening here because you need other people to tell you that you're okay. And this is going to be the y-axis, which is reliance on other people. Because you don't have that, ability to self-soothe yourself. So we have positive, or I guess higher reliance on self, lower reliance on self. The y-axis, which goes up and down, is going to be reliance on other people. So for positive, we have a reliance on other people, right? There's higher reliance. And again, that could really, you can have, somebody, two people who have a high positive reliance on other people, but one person is, closer to average in their relatability with others and reliance on others. And another person is super, super high on that reliance. And this, again, can be positive. It can be negative. I want to keep it neutral because some people actually require reliance on other people. Like they actually need it for their own, abilities to survive. We can talk about like physical disabilities or even children, for example, high reliance on others. Then we have the negative part of that y-axis, which is folks that have like a low reliance on other people. So these are folks that are like, other people are not to be trusted. I can't rely on other people to help me if I need things. These are the lower reliance people. Okay, so think about this quadrant. Okay, we have an x-axis, which is reliance on self. We have a y-axis, which is reliance on other people. Now, let's talk about the 4 attachment styles and how they fit into these 4 quadrants. The first is secure attachment. Now, I don't feel so great about this, but it is the case in this attachment style quadrant, is that just the secure attachment is a secure attachment. Everything else is considered an insecure attachment. There's 3 different types that we really know about, so I'm going to talk to you about those. But let's talk about secure attachment. So here, folks are generally in the, high reliance of self or positive reliance on self and positive reliance on others. So this is somebody who can say like, oh shoot, I'm going through something really stressful. Okay, I think I can take care of it, but you know what? I do need help from somebody else. I'm going to reach out. And there is a sense internally for that person that, yeah, other people will respond to my needs. Like if I, call my friend to help me, move my car, which I, had to do in the last couple of days, like I have a sense that like I'm going to call them and they're going to do it, or they're going to, try their best to do it, and they're going to be honest with me if they can't, and I trust that if they can't, that's really because they can't. So that's a kind of a reliable view of other people. So a secure attachment is somebody who is able to tap into support from others, easily, and also is able to tap into their own internal support that they have and that they've built for themselves. And so that's a secure attachment. Then we have an anxious attachment. So if we scroll over to the left of this quadrant, we have anxious attachment. So folks here have a higher reliance on other people and a low reliance on self. And when caregivers are inconsistent, when you have a parent who's sometimes nurturing and sometimes unavailable, you'll see this sometimes with, parents with depression, for example, would love their children so much, but they're often dissociated, or they're too sad, or they're too tired to get up and do things. This is sometimes can cause like inconsistent parenting. And so these children, they become hyper attuned to the emotions and the nervous system and the well-being of the people around them, but they abandon themselves. And so oftentimes need constant reassurance. That high reliance on others, it actually becomes like a skill that sometimes people kind of spiral into. They become so good at reading other people, but it comes at the cost of not being able to read themselves. And so when something happens, they need another person to be around them. I spoke to someone recently who, he was a young man, and he was telling me that he just cannot be alone. He just cannot be alone. And so we really explored this attachment style, and it seemed to really click with him. Like, oh, wait, actually, who am I? Like, who am I when I am by myself? And it was actually very hard for him to answer that question. And so that's one pathway to go for those who are anxiously attached is how do you balance, reliance on others and reliance on yourself? How do you increase your internal tools to take care of yourself, to know that you'll be okay? And there's so many ways to do that. And also to really honestly assess your relationships and how reciprocal they are. Sometimes people in this category will, to the extent, abandon themselves and remain in abusive relationships because there's some semblance of safety or some semblance of, like familiarity, right? They become so hyper attuned to their parent who would come home angry. And so they find themselves in a relationship with somebody who they have to be super attuned to because they are also angry, or they have to be super attuned to because they are sad, or they have to be super attuned to because that other person, has kind of like this need of being wanted. And so you got this anxiously attached person who's 100% doing that for them at the cost, again, of abandoning themselves. So that's our anxious attached folks. All right, let's come back to this quadrant. If we go down diagonal, so underneath secure attachment, we have our avoidant attachment. And so these are folks that have a high reliance on self, but a low reliance on other people. And so when caregivers or the adults are in this person's life, when they're a child, are emotionally distant or they discourage emotional expression, these kids end up learning to just suppress their needs from other people. And so as adults, they have a hard time struggling to open up or depend on others. Avoidant attachment folks have a very low reliance on other people and a high reliance on themselves. They just kind of learn in their life that, like, you know what, like, I just got to do this by myself. But it gets to a point where they actually truly distrust other people's capacity to be there for them. And that has its own range of issues because, for example, one huge area of concern that this brings up is when that person becomes a parent, what do they teach their children about the world? Consider if either one of your parents or any of your parents, recognizing that people come from blended families as well, any of your parents may be avoidantly attached themselves, where they were just emotionally distant or they didn't really express a lot of emotions with you as a child, and what that taught you about yourself, about your own relationship with your emotions. So that's our avoidant attachment. Oftentimes we find a lot of men in this category because we often, unfortunately, suppress the emotions of men. We discourage the expression. And so they learn to just be self-reliant and then, cue the loneliness epidemic. So we have secure attachment. We talked about anxious attachment, which is high reliance on other people and low reliance on self. Then we have an avoidant attachment, which is high reliance on self and low reliance on others, which leaves us with the last quadrant, which is a low reliance on self and a low reliance on other people. So what is this person relying on? And that's a great question because the name of this attachment category is called disorganized. When a caregiver, when a parent is the source of both comfort and fear, oftentimes in the case of abuse, these children grow up with conflicting strategies and a disorganized attachment. This is a really tricky place to be in for so many reasons. People in this category have kind of a hot and cold relationship with other people, where they're craving intimacy with others, but then reject it when they actually start to experience it, right? They're one day, I love you, the next day I hate you. Maybe not as quickly as that cycle, but have a really, really hard time engaging in intimacy, but also really deeply crave it from other people. They long for closeness, but then they fear it. And oftentimes this particular attachment style, it leads to just emotional chaos. It leads to dissociation. It leads to fragmentation of your inner world. A lot of my clients, I would say, are kind of in this category. Not all of them, but many, many people are in this category. And it's a really, really tough one to work through. Because again, a person in this disorganized attachment experienced both. And so oftentimes you have people kind of grappling with, what about all the good things that happened in my childhood? And how do I make sense of that in parallel with all of the really negative and harmful things that have happened to me and to my family. The other thing about, all of this is it's so these patterns, they aren't label or boxes. They're adaptive responses. The reality is we all have an attachment style. And whatever your attachment style is now is essentially what your best attempt was at staying emotionally safe in relationships that didn't always feel emotionally safe. And the beauty of Allah's mercy is that attachment styles can change. You're not stuck to the same attachment style for the rest of your life at all. Actually, there's some research to show that our attachment style evolves over time through the relationships, the deep, meaningful relationships that we have with the people around us. Another reason that I will really encourage you to join our group, our process group, so that we can really kind of pay attention to what does that even mean to build a meaningful relationship with another person? And are you really, this would be like a great place to kind of test out or try out or explore with the people in the group of like, what have you been doing? What's been working? What's not been working? Through safe and present relationships, including your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can really begin to experience something new. There's a book called Attached, which goes through the attachment styles and patterns, specifically in romantic relationships. I highly recommend that book. But in that book, they talk about, they reference it takes a few years for an attachment style to completely change. The other thing about attachment is that attachment styles is actually, and this is where it gets like a little bit, tricky and more nuanced, if it hasn't already been nuanced, is that you can actually have different attachment styles for different, categories of people. So, for example, you might have a anxious attachment with, your romantic relationship, but have like this avoidant attachment with friends. Or you can have a secure attachment actually with friends, and then a really difficult avoidant attachment in romantic relationships. There's so many reasons for this, including like the level of intimacy that's required. Oftentimes our attachment style will become the loudest when there's some sort of potential issue in a relationship with another person, and how you respond to that potential issue in your relationship with another person is going to tell you a lot about your attachment style. So think about the last time you got into an argument or a conflict with a friend. Let's stick with friends. Were you really anxious about needing to hear back from them that everything is okay? Were you somebody who said, you know what, I don't want to deal with this friend anymore. I'm just going to not be their friend anymore, right? That's more avoidant. Somebody who's seeking reassurance is more anxious. Or were you you know what, I feel like I've done my part in sharing or expressing, my part of this conflict. And, I trust that this person will be able to reflect and, we'll have a conversation later about this. I feel okay to bring up a hard conversation with them. I think our relationship is secure. Or, and a disorganized attached person will really respond in so many different ways. They might respond as an anxious person. They might respond as an avoidant person. They might kind of flip-flop between the two. And so paying attention to what happens when there is conflict in that particular relationship will tell you what kind of attachment you have with that particular person. So to give myself as an example, I've had several friends, particular friends, where I'm I don't even know what it is about them. And I've told them this. I'm I don't know what it is about you, but I have an anxious relationship with you. I feel like I need you to tell me that you love me all the time. Whereas with other folks, I feel that I have a very secure relationship where I completely trust that if there was, something that I did that upset them, that they will tell me, and that, we'll be able to work through it, that our relationship is bigger than that. Our relationship with each of our parents is going to be different, have a different attachment style. Sometimes our relationship with our kids, our relationship with people around us. So there's really so much there to kind of explore, but taking a second to really pay attention to what your style is, how you respond to the people around you, is part of the awareness process. It's part of like paying attention to yourself, paying attention to your mind, to your body, to yourself, which is where grounding becomes super important. We need to be able to ground ourselves and bring us back to homeostasis so that we can actually reflect on what just happened. All right, so that's attachment theory. The second piece here is called attunement. Attunement is one of the most powerful and often missing pieces of childhood. So attunement, when you are attuned to someone or when your caregiver is attuned to you, that means that they notice in real time your emotional state. They can understand it without judgment and respond with care and accuracy. When you're attuned to the person next to you, you have a pretty good sense of what they might be experiencing, and a caregiver would respond. So imagine a child who falls and scrapes their knee. An attuned parent wouldn't say, "You're fine, stop crying." They'll actually kneel down, they'll look the child in the eye, and they'll say, like, "That looked really scary, and I see that you're hurt. Or I'm here for you. Is there anything that you need?" It's not about fixing. It's about being with. And I find that this is a very, very, very hard thing for many people to do. And honestly, especially around grief. Really around any difficult, intense emotion. We have such a hard time just sitting with somebody who is upset. Just sitting with somebody who's angry. Just sitting with somebody who's going through sadness or pain. Just sit with them and be with. That's what attunement is. It's not about fixing. We feel like, oh, well, I don't know what to say. Like, I want to take this pain away. Don't. You don't need to. Just that process of attunement, just that process of looking at somebody and saying, like, I hear you. Like, that sucks, dude. That goes a long way in our healing process. A long way. And so, imagine a child, again, who is developing, who's learning these skills, who require attunement in order for them to understand what they are going through themselves. A child needs an adult to look at them and say, "It looks like you're sad. I think you're hungry. Let's figure out what you're experiencing." So that child, when they turn into an adult and they grow up and they become more independent, they're able to do that for themselves. They're able to be self-reliant in a healthy way. But also that attunement develops the reliance on other people, because there's an understanding that other people are going to help me, but I also need to help myself. Unfortunately, many of us didn't really experience attunement in healthy and consistent ways, or at all even. Instead, we were ignored. You know, some of us have experienced just being ignored. So a parent might say, "Stop crying," or "I'll give you something to cry about." Shame also exists here, where a parent might say, why are you always being so dramatic? Why are you making that face? Like, it wasn't that bad. Or gaslighting, right? That didn't actually happen. You're just too sensitive. I was there. I didn't feel what you felt. So therefore, that what you experience is not real. And so when that happens, the child learns that their emotions are either wrong or too much or invisible. And they begin to disconnect from their own internal cues. We begin to disconnect from our own internal cues when the adults around us are not able to attune with us, to attune to our needs, our instincts, and our sense of self. And this is how generational trauma gets transmitted. It's not just through abuse, but also through the absence of being seen. It's not always, people are yelling and crying and people are getting hit. There's so many ways that this trauma can be transmitted. So in the case of a child that, goes through something really scary, for example, but have learned, right? We can talk about a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old will learn that, I can't go to my parent. They're just going to yell at me. So that 5-year-old who went through something scary, potentially, for example, saw a car accident, right? Like, like actually fell and scraped their knee, which can be quite, like traumatizing for a little kid, right? They may not go to the parent, and so they'll sit there and try to figure it out themselves. And there's so many reasons that a parent would not, or the adults around a child would not be able to attune to that child. There's so many reasons. I want to take just like a second here to pause and say, like, this is not a blame game in any way. This is not a blame game. I am not here to blame parents. I'm not here to blame individuals. But what I will do is I will blame the systems that cause us to respond in this way, that the systems that require that a parent is working 2 jobs, or the system that enables and maintains white supremacy and racism and sexism in ways that cause so much distress for the parent. There's actually a lot of research that shows that racism causes trauma. Like it's actually a traumatic experience for us to consistently be in this like toxic state of stress all the time. So consider just that alone, let alone all the other things that we're all kind of going through and experiencing. And again, this work becomes just so important, that self-attunement. How do you check in with yourself now? How do you know when you're upset? What's your kind of litmus test to know when you need to experience some like self-soothing for yourself? Okay, so attachment, attunement, and this third piece is mirroring. So mirroring is when your emotions, needs, and experiences are reflected back to you with empathy. And that really helps you internalize a sense of worth. That I exist, I matter, I make sense. I had one student who I just enjoyed so much having as a student. She, signed up for several of my classes. But she would say sometimes, she said this in several classes and I really liked it, which is, her name is Shay, by the way. She said, I just believe that everybody makes sense. And I thought that was so profound, because she's right. Everybody does make sense, even if it's not like a logical, rational sense that we can get to right now. But there's a reason for why or how you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And so when a child is really happy, a mirrored response is that the caregiver, the adult, just smiles at them, right? Is happy with them. Or when a child is scared, a mirrored response would say, whoa, that was loud. You did not like that, did you? That must have been really scary for you. And so without mirroring, sometimes we grow up really confused about our sense of self. We're constantly looking to other people to tell us who we are and how we are, or sometimes we even stop looking altogether. But with mirroring, we learn my feelings are real. I can trust myself. I am worthy of care. And here's where Islam really gives us such a gift, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always sees you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-basir, the one who sees. And so when human caregivers may have failed you, I want you to be able to tap into the divine attunement that is always available. Always available. So when you cry to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in dua, you're being mirrored. Consider the hadith, when you walk to God, He runs to you. When you reflect on your pain through this faith-based lens, you have such an immense, incredible opportunity to repair your attachment. And not just to other people, but also to your own ruh, to your own soul. So healing attachment, it's not about blaming your caregivers, like I said. It's about understanding what was missing so that you can learn to give it to yourself and others. Dr. Anisa Nadir, who I interviewed for a podcast episode on Finding the One, she has an incredible program that she runs every fall. It's like a 15-week course on knowing yourself and kind of all the internal work that you need to do before you get married. But also, even if you are in a relationship, she does an incredible job with this class. But in that podcast episode, she said to me that sometimes we don't want to look back. We don't want to look back at the memories. because they're really painful. But she says that you have to, in order to know yourself, in order to really respond authentically in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you, you have to sit and think about that. And sometimes it really is the case that it's too intense. So if it's too intense for you, if any of this is too intense for you, which in other words, I'm saying like if your nervous system is responding too intensely to any of this work, then I need you to pause. And I need you to make sure that you have the ability to come in and out of this so that you are not flooding yourself. And so even with all of this, it's important to be able to process. To process not everything. You don't need to process every single thing that's ever happened to you, but to process the general patterns and the general themes. And so the process group that we have going on will be a great place to do that. But so will a therapist or an adult or a caregiver. So I want you to be able to process with others. If it feels like your own nervous system gets flooded, you can work to co-regulate with another person, even as an adult. This work is about becoming that parent that you needed and still need, the friend that you longed for, the witness that your pain deserves. You can rewire your attachment system and you can practice attunement with yourself, with your children, with your partner, with your community. You can be the one who breaks the cycle. And when you do, you don't just heal yourself. You begin a new legacy. Okay. All right. So let's move to the next section, which is a little bit more about family dynamics and culture. This is going to be a much shorter section. We're almost done with this episode, I believe. You probably know more than me since it's already been recorded when you're listening to it. But let's talk about how trauma shapes our self-worth and our worldview that kind of evolves through these family dynamics and culture. So in emotionally unsafe households, we often develop disordered beliefs to survive. I'm only valuable when I achieve. Conflict means abandonment. It's actually safer not to feel. Love must be earned. Sometimes these are beliefs that we pick up on from the behaviors of our parents or sometimes directly from the messages that they give us. These aren't personality traits, they're protective adaptations. And family dynamics, they can assign us roles that really embed these internal beliefs that become core to our sense of self. You might be the caretaker in your family, the one who takes the emotional or physical responsibility for others, often at the cost of their own. It develops in response to instability. And it unfortunately teaches a child that love is earned through self-sacrifice. There's also the scapegoat. This is the family member that's blamed for conflict or dysfunction, regardless of their actual behavior. Usually the scapegoat in a family is the one person, sometimes two people, that actually express the emotions that the rest of the family is suppressing. And so then is unfairly labeled as the problem. But really what they're experiencing or expressing, the scapegoat, is actually a symptom of what's happening in the entire family dynamic, but becomes a very convenient way for the rest of the family to point at one person and say they are the problem. Now, some of you might already be thinking, oh, shoot, that kind of sounds like me. Or some of you might be thinking about a particular person in your family that's not you, who is the scapegoat. Think about generally the person who's like the most ill in a family. Generally, their illness might be, and this is not always the case, but sometimes their illness is really a symptom of the dynamics in the entire family. Then we have the golden child. So the golden child is idealized and expected to uphold the family's image through achievement or obedience. These folks often they suppress their own authentic self to meet the high expectations and avoid disapproval of others. Again, this is one that, I'm sure many of our families have, the golden child, the one that can do no wrong. These are all, I want to say again, they're not personality traits. They're protective adaptation. All of these. The family dynamics involve so many people interacting with one another. And through the attachment styles, through the specific circumstances and contexts of our family and of our upbringing, of our neighborhood, of the country that we live in addition to our actual just regular temperaments, in addition to our intelligence, just like the base intelligence that we were born with, including add on to that the talents or gifts that we naturally have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gifted us with. All of these things kind of come together and interact with one another to result in the role that you've been assigned. So we talked about the caretaker, the scapegoat, the golden child, and then there's the invisible one. I think oftentimes we talk about the middle child as being the invisible one, the one who disappears emotionally or physically to avoid burdening the family. They're often overlooked and they just learn to silence their needs and stay small to stay safe. Now, I know I said the middle child, but this is not always the middle child, of course. And so I want you to think expansively about who might fit in this category. So sometimes we step into these roles so early that we forget, and it takes us a long time to realize that that's not actually who we are. So identifying these roles is going to be the first step towards changing them. But this work requires honesty. And oftentimes, it also requires grief. Grief for the childhood that you didn't have. Grief for the patterns that we've absorbed. Grief for the harm our loved ones couldn't and still can't stop themselves from passing on. And grief is an integral part of this transformation. So I don't want you to walk away from it, but instead appreciate that grief and loss and death exist around us all the time, and that there's a beauty and a lesson to learn. It is such a difficult experience, grief, for so many reasons, depending on the type of grief, how long you've been grieving, etc. There's so much there, but we cannot walk away from the reality of that experience because it's part of the process. It's part of realizing and letting go and moving forward is being able to grieve the past. All right. So, we are reaching the end of the episode. I have some here, some tools and reflections that I wanted to kind of share with you all. But honestly, I feel that there's so much information here that what I want to do really is just give you one journaling prompt. In this journaling prompt, like I've said before, you don't have to actually journal it, in a piece of paper, although there's a lot of science to show us that being able to write our thoughts down, we start using all these different parts of our brain, our hands, the mechanical pieces, the verbal parts of our brain, etc. So I do recommend journaling. I highly, highly recommend it, but I recognize that we're all kind of in different, we have different relationships to writing. So at the very least, talk with a friend or talk out loud to yourself. But your prompt for this module is, what family patterns do I want to heal or transform? And let this be a place of deep honesty. You're not betraying your family by telling the truth. You're actually honoring them by breaking the cycle and keeping the good and getting rid of the bad. So I want to leave you with this reflection. You may not be responsible for what you inherited, but you do have power over what you pass on. And healing, it doesn't mean rejecting your lineage. It means tending to it with love and clarity and choice. And as the Quran reminds us, no soul bears the burden of another. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Rahman, the merciful, gives us the tools to lighten our own. And so in the next module, we're going to start exploring how healing happens. We spent so much time so far talking about what is trauma? How does it show up? How can we recognize it? How do we identify what's going on? And so moving forward for the rest of the modules, but we'll start with the next one, is we're going to talk about healing. And so until then, I want you to be gentle with what you uncover. And I want to remind you that you are not alone in this work. And again, sign up for the 7-week support group. It's open if you want a space to process and be witnessed alongside other people who are also going through similar questions on this journey. Please take care of yourself. Drink some water. Go for a walk. Hug someone. And inshallah, I will see you in the next module. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.